Hello there, children. Hope you are doing well. The purpose of this video is really to address just a couple questions that I've gotten regarding a couple of the discussion questions and to try and make things easier or, clarify what I'm looking for and how we can gather such conclusions from the film in question. So specifically, the questions I'm addressing refer to how Ilsa's depiction in Casablanca reflects society's views toward women and how Sam's depiction reflects society's views toward non-whites. In general, we can gather such information and make such conclusions simply because films, like all forms of art or all forms of expression, are products of the time they were made in. Whether it's intentional or not, filmmakers, artists, writers, whatever you want to call it, all creators, their works are going to reflect to some degree the culture and the society they live in and they grew up in. And Casablanca is no exception. As a movie that was made in the 1940s, it does provide a window into the way that women and Black Americans were generally viewed by the mainstream culture in that period. 80 years ago. It is still kind of crazy to think when you think about how old this movie is. So the way we can see those values and those perspectives reflected in the movie is by looking at how major female and Black characters are presented and portrayed. So in the case of women, our best example is going to be Ilsa. She's the main female character. In the case of African Americans, we have to look at Sam because he's the only major non-white character in the entire movie. And when we're looking at how their depictions reflect societal values, what that means is we're looking at how they act towards other people and how other people act towards them and seem to treat them or view them. So if we're looking at Ilsa, some important things to consider would be, what are her main character traits? How does the film characterize her? How do other people, in this case, how do men treat her? And how does she act towards men? And by and large, we can see how the filmmakers are presenting Ilsa in a way that make her seem rather dependent and, if not deferential, towards men. Throughout the film, she's depicted it several times as being rather over-emotional to the point where she needs the strong, logical mind and wills of men to think for her, as she puts it, to make decisions for her and to help her get through what she's going through. So in that sense, she's depicted as being rather dependent on men and a bit too emotional to function on her own. Which does kind of, at least from our perspective, this kind of shows us, the audience, how this society seemed to view women as being, again, dependent on men and too emotional to really be self-sufficient or self-reliant actors of their own. Furthermore, if we see the main way that men view Ilsa, the main trait they always come back to is really her beauty. The one main character trait of hers that they all really discuss is her beauty. which again kind of reflects the major way that society valued women at that time. And you could also argue that not much has changed today, but it's especially pronounced in this movie when, again, the main thing that comes to mind for the men when they talk about Ilsa is how beautiful she is. So looking at how she acts towards men, we can see again how the filmmakers are presenting women in a way that makes them seem dependent on men and over emotional, while we also see through the way that men act towards women, we can see that men kind of view that they need to sort of take a leadership role when it comes to their interactions with women, and that the main thing they value women for was their appearance. Moving on to Sam. Sam's depiction is actually rather interesting because it's actually a rather progressive movie for the time, and yet it still definitely does depict the typical way race relations were going of the time, which were still not great. So in the movie, if we're looking at Sam's role in the movie, Sam is the piano player in Rick's Cafe Americain. And his main character traits seem to be he's just kind of an easygoing, loyal, dedicated, just all around nice guy that everybody likes. No one really seems to have a bad word to say about Sam. Everyone loves Sam, and Sam seems to love everyone and generally want what's best for everyone, particularly when it comes to Rick. I think it is, and this is kind of where I think this movie is ahead of its time, in the sense that it, at least in my opinion, I think it does portray a genuine friendship between a white man and a black man. I think Rick and Sam are legitimately friends. They do legitimately care about each other. But this is not a friendship of equals, and this is where Casablanca is still a product of the 1940s. So while Sam and Rick may be friends, they are not equals, and they do not treat each other as equals. If we're looking at how Sam treats Rick and white people in general, he is very deferential and respectful towards them. Notably, even when it's characters that he's quite close to, like Rick, he does not ever address them by their first name. There's always some form of title attached to it. So he never calls Rick Rick. He always addresses him as Mr. Rick or boss. In the case of Ilsa, again, he never calls her Ilsa. It's always Miss Ilsa. So through the simple action of referring to white characters not as just by their names, but as a Mr. or Miss, or by like boss, it's a subtle indication that Sam does not view himself of the same social status or rank as these white people, which reflects the prevailing societal norms of the time, where Black Americans were not of equal social status as white people. And that, at least in this film made by predominantly white filmmakers for a predominantly white audience, they were not going to present a relationship or a depiction of African Americans that contradicted the racial norms of the time. You can also see how the way white characters address Sam reflects their acknowledgement of this racial hierarchy as well. Ilsa, for example, refers to Sam as boy. When she first walks into Rick's, she asks a waiter who is the boy playing the piano, even though Sam, at least by appearances, seems to be several years older than her. She's still referring to him as boy, which again reflects this social hierarchy that is based on race. That even though Ilsa at least seems to be substantially younger than Sam, she still feels comfortable referring to him as boy because he is Black. and she's white. That also that kind of reflects or further reinforces the film's depiction of the norm when it came to race relations at the time. What's also interesting, if you look at the broader depiction of Rick's Cafe Americain, you also see a common trend of de facto segregation of the time, where even if certain establishments, like certain clubs or venues, were not officially segregated like they were throughout the South, there would at least be an unofficial segregation going on, where generally it was understood that white people would not go to predominantly black venues or black clubs, and black people conversely would not go to predominantly white clubs or white venues. And we see that reflected in the depiction of Rick's Cafe Americain, in the sense that Sam is the only non-white person in that club, and notably, he's not a patron; he's an employee. He's a performer, and that does reflect the norms of the time, where in predominantly white clubs, you'd have situations where black people would be accepted there as performers or as employees, but not as patrons. And so while it doesn't seem likely that Rick would have an official policy saying like that was a whites only establishment, you can definitely see that culturally, at least, it had become a de facto whites-only establishment, even though the policy might not have been official, which reflected the norms of the period and how, in general, white people and black people did not intermingle that much, and that most of the time when they did interact, it was in situations where black people were serving white people or were the employees for white people. So hopefully that clears some of the things regarding the depiction of African Americans and women up, and makes those questions easier. And also, it is rather interesting to look at the culture that this movie was made in and see how the movie reflects that culture. And also you can kind of start to see the development of American culture along different paths and along different avenues. So yeah, and hopefully that clears things up. We'll start moving into your final project and the final test over Casablanca later this week, early next week, and hopefully when we come back, we'll be able to pick right up and get moving with 7. So that should be good. If you guys have any questions or need clarification on anything, just let me know. Take care.